They expected hard labor, maybe punishment, perhaps even death. But when American inspectors arrived at the remote Louisiana camp in February 1945, what they found made even hardened soldiers turn away in horror. 6 freshly dug graves. 6 Japanese women who had survived the Pacific War, survived the long journey to America, only to die in captivity on American soil. The Japanese prisoners stood with shovels in their hands, dirt under their fingernails, tears streaming down faces. They tried to keep stoic. "We buried 6 women today," one man said in broken English, his voice hollow. The Americans had been told this was a model facility. Instead, they discovered a tragedy that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. If stories like this move you, please hit that like button and subscribe. These forgotten chapters of history deserve to be remembered. The train rolled through the Louisiana countryside in the autumn of 1944, its rhythm a constant reminder of how far they had traveled from home. Inside the cramped cattle cars, 43 Japanese prisoners sat in silence, their faces gaunt from months of inadequate rations, their bodies still bearing the marks of the brutal Pacific campaign. Among them were 7 women, comfort women and nurses who had been captured alongside soldiers during the fall of Saipan. The journey had been long and cruel. First, the crowded transport ships from Saipan to Hawaii, where they had been held in a temporary processing camp. Then another ship to San Francisco, where they had glimpsed America for the first time through the small portholes of their detention area. Finally, this train journey across an entire continent, from the Pacific coast through mountains and deserts and plains to the humid swamplands of Louisiana. The September heat was oppressive, even with the small windows cracked open. Sweat dripped down faces that had not seen proper washing in weeks. The air smelled of unwashed bodies, fear, and the peculiar staleness that comes from too many people confined in too small a space for too long. Outside, endless fields of sugarcane stretched toward horizons they could barely see through the narrow gaps in the wooden slats. The landscape was alien, nothing like the volcanic islands they had known or the rice paddies of home. Some of the prisoners had tried to keep track of time, marking days on scraps of paper or the wooden walls of the cattle car, but the monotony of travel had eroded their sense of time. Had it been 3 weeks since San Francisco? 4? The days blurred together into an endless succession of stops and starts, of bread and water passed through the doors, of using buckets in the corner for sanitation, of sleeping sitting up because there was no room to lie down. Kenji, a former sergeant who had fought at Saipan until ammunition ran out, sat with his back against the wall, eyes closed but mind racing. At 32, he was one of the older prisoners, a career soldier who had joined the Imperial Army at 18 with dreams of honor and glory. Those dreams had died slowly over the years of war, replaced by the grim reality of survival. His uniform, once crisp and proper, was now little more than rags held together by dirt and determination. Shrapnel scars crossed his left shoulder and back, souvenirs from an artillery barrage that had killed most of his unit. Next to him, a young private named Hiroshi, barely 20, stared at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. The boy had been a student before the war, studying literature at a university in Tokyo, drafted into a conflict he never understood. His hands, which should have been holding books and pens, had instead held rifles and grenades. He had killed men in the caves of Saipan, watched his friends die, surrendered only when his commanding officer had been killed and there was no one left to give orders. The guilt of survival weighed on him every waking moment. Across from them, separated by an unspoken boundary of propriety even in these degraded circumstances, sat the 7 women. Each had her own story of how the war had consumed her life, how duty or coercion or simple bad luck had placed her on Saipan when the Americans came. Yuki, 28, had been a nurse in a Tokyo hospital before the war. She had volunteered for military service out of patriotic duty, believing she could make a difference, save lives. On Saipan, she had worked in a field hospital carved into a cave, performing amputations by candlelight, watching men die from infections she could not treat with her dwindling supplies. Her medical bag, which she clutched to her chest like a talisman, contained the last remnants of her profession. A few bandages, half a bottle of iodine, a precious handful of aspirin tablets, surgical scissors that she kept obsessively clean. Beside her sat Akiko, 35, a schoolteacher who had taught children to read and write until the military had requisitioned her school for barracks and sent her to work in a uniform factory on Saipan. She hummed softly, a children's song she had taught her students years ago, the melody seeming absurdly out of place in this cattle car crossing Louisiana. She had a daughter back in Japan, would be 9 now if she had survived the bombings. Akiko did not know. She had received no word, no letters, nothing. The not knowing was its own torture. Midori, 24, had always been frail, with weak lungs that made her cough even before the war. She had worked as a secretary in a government office, a quiet job that suited her gentle nature. The military had sent her to Saipan to handle administrative work, filing reports, and typing orders. When the Americans invaded, she had fled with everyone else into the caves, breathing the damp air that made her lungs burn, coughing until she tasted blood. Now, in this train car, she coughed constantly, a wet, rattling sound that made Yuki's medical training scream warnings. Fumiko, 26, came from a fishing village where her family had worked the boats for generations. She had been healthy and strong before the war, capable of hauling nets and gutting fish from dawn to dusk. The military had taken her to work in the kitchens on Saipan, feeding the soldiers, stretching rations that grew more meager by the month. In the final weeks before the American assault, there had been almost nothing to cook. Seaweed soup, rice with more chaff than grain, whatever could be foraged from the jungle. The starvation had weakened her, and fever had taken hold during the brutal journey to Louisiana, burning inside her like a slow fire that never quite went out. Sachiko, 29, was a farmer's daughter from northern Japan, where her family had grown rice in terraced fields carved into hillsides. She knew the rhythm of seasons, the careful work of planting and harvest. The war had disrupted everything, taking first her brothers for soldiers, then her father for labor battalions, finally her when the government needed workers for factories. She had ended up on Saipan making ammunition in a concrete bunker that shook with every explosion when the Americans bombed the island. Her hands, calloused from farm work, had learned to assemble artillery shells with the same patient precision she had once used to plant rice seedlings. Reiko, 31, had been a widow even before the war took everything else. Her husband had died of tuberculosis, leaving her alone with debts she could not pay. She had worked as a seamstress to survive, mending clothes and making uniforms, until the military had conscripted her skills for the war effort. On Saipan, she had sewn in a factory that became a tomb when American shells collapsed the roof. She had escaped with only minor cuts, but the memory of those who had not escaped haunted her nights with dreams of bodies buried in rubble. And finally, Ayami, barely 18, the youngest of them all. She had finished school just months before being sent to Saipan, a bright girl who had dreamed of becoming a teacher like Akiko. Instead, she had been assigned to a communications office, listening to radio transmissions and copying down orders. She remembered the day the American invasion began, the sudden silence when all the radios went dead at once, the terrifying realization that they were cut off, alone, that no help would come. She was still more girl than woman, her face not yet hardened by experience, though her eyes had seen things no one her age should see. When the train finally lurched to a stop, the sudden silence was deafening. For a moment, no one moved. Then the doors screeched open and blinding Louisiana sunlight poured in, so bright after the dimness that several prisoners raised their hands to shield their eyes. The smell hit them next, fresh air mixed with the earthy scent of the bayou, so different from the salt and coral of the Pacific Islands they had left behind. American voices barked commands in English that few understood. Guards in clean uniforms stood with rifles ready, their faces unreadable beneath helmet brims. The prisoners were ordered out, stumbling on legs that had forgotten how to stand after days of travel. Some fell to their knees on the wooden platform, others caught themselves against the train car, their bodies protesting every movement. The camp itself appeared before them as they were marched down a dirt road. Rows of wooden barracks surrounded by double fences of barbed wire, guard towers at each corner, and an administration building that looked hastily constructed. This was Camp Livingston, a sprawling complex that had been built quickly to handle the unexpected influx of Japanese prisoners after the Marianas Campaign. The main camp, housing German and Italian POWs, sprawled to the north. This smaller annex, hastily erected in a cleared section of swampland, was designated for the Japanese. The ground was soft, still damp from recent rains. Mosquitoes rose in clouds from standing water, pooled in tire tracks and footprints. The air was thick, humid in a way that made breathing feel like work. This was not the dry heat of the Pacific Atolls, but something heavier, more oppressive, laden with moisture that seemed to seep into clothes, skin, lungs. Kenji looked at the camp and felt something twist in his stomach. He had expected a prison, had prepared himself for cruelty, but this looked worse somehow, neglected, forgotten, thrown together without thought or care. The barracks sagged slightly, their roofs patched with mismatched materials. The fences were intact, but the ground around them was overgrown with weeds. It looked like a place that no one wanted to think about, let alone manage properly. The women were separated immediately. An American officer, consulting a clipboard, pointed toward a smaller barrack at the far end of the compound. The 7 were marched away, their footsteps squelching in the mud, while the men watched in silence. Yuki glanced back once, her eyes finding Kenji's. In that brief moment, he saw fear. Not the fear of battle or bombardment, but something quieter and more insidious. The fear of being forgotten. The separation felt wrong. In Japan, in the military, in the islands, there had been order, hierarchy, rules. Here, in this muddy camp in the middle of Louisiana swampland, there was only confusion and the slow realization that they had been delivered to a place that was not prepared for them, did not want them, and might not care what happened to them. As the guards processed them, checking names against lists, searching through their meager possessions, young Hiroshi leaned close to Kenji and whispered, "Will they kill us here?" Kenji did not answer. He did not know. But looking at the neglected state of the camp, at the disorganized guards, at the way the women's barracks stood isolated from everything else, He wondered if death might not be the worst thing that could happen in a place like this. Sometimes being forgotten was worse. The processing station was a wooden building that smelled of chemicals and mildew. The prisoners were lined up outside, waiting their turn while guards barked orders and pointed at signs in English that none of them could read. The September sun beat down mercilessly, and several prisoners swayed on their feet, weak from the journey and months of poor nutrition. When Kenji's turn came, he was directed inside where American medics in white coats waited. They were not unkind, but they were brusque, efficient, processing bodies rather than people. His clothes were taken, his head shaved, his body sprayed with DDT powder that made him cough and his eyes water. The chemical smell was overwhelming, acrid, burning in his nose and throat. The shower that followed was cold, not the refreshing cold of a mountain stream, but the shocking cold of pipes that had not been properly connected to any heating system. He stood under the spray for exactly 2 minutes, timed by a guard with a stopwatch, scrubbing away months of grime with a bar of harsh soap that left his skin feeling raw. He emerged to find a pile of clothes waiting: olive drab work pants, a shirt with PW stenciled on the back in large white letters, worn boots that did not quite fit, a thin blanket. Everything smelled of disinfectant and previous occupants. The clothes had been used before, passed down from prisoner to prisoner, the fabric thin in places, patched in others. The women went through a similar process, but their experience was worse. There was no female staff available. Male guards stood outside the processing room while a nervous young private, barely out of his teens himself, tried to maintain some semblance of professional distance while checking them for contraband. The humiliation was profound. Yuki, the nurse, kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her jaw clenched so tight it ached. Akiko trembled but made no sound. Young Ayame wept silently, tears running down her face as she clutched the thin shift they had given her to wear. The delousing powder made Midori cough until she retched. She had always had weak lungs, a condition that had kept her from more strenuous war work but had not saved her from being swept up in the chaos of Saipan's fall. The cold shower left her shaking uncontrollably. Fumiko tried to help her, wrapping her in the thin blanket they had been given, but it offered little warmth. The mess hall was a long wooden structure with rows of tables and benches. The men were marched there first, ordered to sit and wait. The smell of food, actual cooked food, filled the air, and stomachs that had been empty for so long cramped with sudden, desperate hunger. What arrived on their trays was both wonderful and terrible. Wonderful because it was food, real food in quantities they had not seen in months. Terrible because it was clearly leftover, the remnants of what the American soldiers had not wanted. Watery stew with chunks of gristle, bread that was hard at the edges and soft in the middle from sitting too long, potatoes that had gone slightly gray, coffee so weak it was barely colored water. Still, after months of near-starvation rations on the transport ships, after the desperate final weeks on Saipan when they had been eating grass and whatever could be foraged, this meal was a feast. Hiroshi ate so fast he made himself sick, retching into a bucket while the others looked away, embarrassed for him. Kenji ate slowly, methodically, forcing himself to chew each bite even though every instinct screamed to devour everything at once. Around him, men wept as they ate. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of having food in their bellies. Some laughed, the sound bordering on hysteria. Others simply stared at their trays in disbelief, as if the food might disappear if they looked away. The women ate separately in their own barrack. Their portions were smaller, the quality even worse than what the men received. The stew was mostly broth with a few floating vegetables. The bread was the hardest pieces, the ends and corners that no one else wanted. There was no coffee, only water that tasted faintly of rust from old pipes. Yuki divided her portion carefully, giving extra to Midori, who was still shaking from the cold shower. "Eat," she urged. "You need strength." But Midori could barely swallow, her throat tight with illness and fear. Sachiko, a farmer's daughter who had been pressed into service-making uniforms before being caught in Saipan's collapse, tried to make conversation to maintain some normalcy, but the words died in the oppressive silence of their isolation. The men's barracks were crowded but functional. Rows of bunk beds lined both walls, each with a thin mattress and the single blanket they had been issued. A pot-bellied stove sat in the center, unlit despite the evening chill. Windows at either end were covered with screens, but several had tiers, letting in mosquitoes that descended in hungry swarms as darkness fell. Kenji claimed a lower bunk near the back, away from the door where guards might look in during night checks. Hiroshi took the bunk above him, and they lay in the growing darkness, listening to the sounds of 43 men trying to find some comfort in a place that offered none. Snoring, weeping, whispered prayers, the rustle of bodies shifting on creaking springs, the slap of hands against skin as mosquitoes bit and were killed. The women's barrack was smaller, more isolated. 7 beds for 7 women. The building had not been properly sealed. Gaps showed between the wallboards where rain could enter, where wind whistled through. The roof had a visible patch where it had been repaired, but already water stains showed that the repair was failing. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, its light weak and flickering. There was no stove. When Yuki asked a guard about heat, he shrugged and said something in English they could not understand. His meaning was clear enough. This was what they had, and they would make do. That first night, the temperature dropped. Not severely by Louisiana standards, but enough. Enough that the women huddled together on two beds, sharing blankets, sharing warmth, trying to forget that they were prisoners in a foreign land, forgotten by those who were supposed to protect them. Ayami, the youngest, cried herself to sleep, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Akiko stroked her hair, humming that same children's song from earlier, her voice cracking with exhaustion and sorrow. Midori coughed through the night, a wet, rattling sound that made Yuki's medical training scream warnings she tried to ignore. In the darkness, Reiko whispered, "How long will we be here?" No one answered because no one knew, and the not knowing was perhaps the worst part of all. The routine established itself with brutal efficiency. Wake at 6 to a harsh bell that clanged across the camp, the sound echoing off the wooden buildings and making everyone's head ache. Stand for roll call in whatever weather prevailed, rain that soaked through their thin clothes, heat that made the ground shimmer with mirages, the occasional cool morning when fog rolled in from the bayou and made everything damp and gray. Breakfast at 7, the same watery coffee and hard bread every morning, sometimes with a spoonful of jam that was more sugar than fruit, sometimes with nothing at all. Work details were assigned at 8, the guards reading names from clipboards while the prisoners stood in formation, backs straight despite exhaustion, maintaining the discipline that had been drilled into them. The men were divided into crews: road maintenance, fence repair, ditch digging, supply hauling, kitchen duty, latrine cleaning. The work was hard, pointless, designed to fill time rather than accomplish anything useful. Kenji was assigned to a detail that maintained the dirt roads around the camp. Every day he and 5 others raked gravel into potholes, smoothed ruts left by truck tires, cleared debris that accumulated overnight. Every night, rain or truck traffic undid their work. The futility of it gnawed at him. He had been a sergeant, a leader of men, someone with purpose and responsibility. Now he was reduced to endlessly smoothing roads that would never stay smooth, filling holes that would reappear tomorrow, performing labor that served no purpose except to keep prisoners busy and break their spirits. The other men in his crew were similarly broken by the meaninglessness. There was Takeshi, a former corporal who had lost an eye on Saipan and now wore a dirty bandage over the socket. There was Jun, who had been a fisherman before the war and spoke constantly of the ocean, of the smell of salt water and the cry of gulls, as if talking about it could bring it back. There was old Makoto, 45 and ancient by soldier standards, whose back had been broken by months of hard labor and healed crooked, leaving him in constant pain. There was young Daiichi, 17, who had lied about his age to enlist and now regretted every day of that decision. They worked in silence mostly, speaking only when necessary, conserving energy for the labor that never ended. During breaks, they sat in whatever shade they could find and watched the guards, trying to understand these Americans who had defeated them. The guards were young, mostly, farm boys from Louisiana and Texas and Oklahoma who had never expected to be guarding Japanese prisoners in a swamp. Some were cruel in small ways, shouting orders, withholding water during breaks, assigning extra work for minor infractions. Others were simply indifferent, treating the prisoners as problems to be managed rather than people to be supervised. Hiroshi worked in the kitchen, washing dishes and pots for the guards' meals. He saw the food they ate, steaks, fresh vegetables, pies, and cakes, and watched as the leftovers were carelessly scraped into bins rather than given to the prisoners. Once he tried to salvage a half-eaten piece of bread from the trash. A guard caught him, boxed his ears, and assigned him to latrine duty for a week. The women had no work assignments. They were simply there, confined to their barrack except for meals and the occasional supervised trip to the latrine. Days stretched into weeks with nothing to do but sit, talk in whispers, and watch through the gaps in the walls as the men worked. The boredom was crushing. Worse than the hunger, worse than the cold, was the absolute nothingness of their existence. Yuki tried to maintain some structure. Morning exercises, though they had barely enough room to move. Language lessons, teaching the others what little English she knew. She rationed out medical supplies from her bag, a few aspirin, bandages, antiseptic, treating small cuts and illnesses with the care of someone trying to hold back an ocean with a teaspoon. But illness came anyway. It started with Midori's cough, which never truly went away after that first night. Then Fumiko developed a fever that spiked and fell but never fully broke. Ayami complained of stomach pains that doubled her over. The cold, the damp, the stress, the inadequate nutrition, all of it took its toll. October brought cooler temperatures and more rain. The camp turned to mud, thick and clinging, that sucked at boots and made every step an effort. The men slogged through it on their work details, arriving back at the barracks each evening, caked in muck up to their knees. Through the fence, they could sometimes see the main camp where the German and Italian prisoners were housed. The contrast was stark and bitter. Those barracks had proper heating. Those prisoners received Red Cross packages, chocolate, cigarettes, writing paper, warm socks. They were allowed to send and receive mail. They had a recreation yard with volleyball nets and a makeshift soccer field. They worked in the camp gardens and ate fresh vegetables from their own labor. The Japanese prisoners received none of this. No Red Cross packages because Japan had not signed the Geneva Convention properly, and the Red Cross could not guarantee access to Allied prisoners in Japanese camps. No mail service because the war in the Pacific raged on, and communications were impossible. No recreation because, as one guard put it with brutal honesty, nobody gives a damn what you Japs do with yourselves. Kenji stood at the fence one evening, watching German POWs laugh and play cards under electric lights in a heated recreation hall. One of them noticed him watching and waved, almost friendly. The gesture made Kenji's throat tight with emotions he could not name. These were the enemy, or had been. Germany had been Japan's ally. And yet here, in captivity, the Germans were treated as prisoners of war deserving of basic decency, while the Japanese were treated as something less than human. The food grew worse as autumn deepened. The portions shrank. The quality, already poor, deteriorated further. Breakfast was often just bread and water. Lunch was soup so thin you could see the bottom of the bowl through it. Dinner was whatever scraps remained from the guards' meals, supplemented with rice so old it had weevils in it. The men picked out the insects methodically and ate anyway. Hunger left no room for disgust. The women's rations were smaller still. Yuki began to notice that they were losing weight, not the healthy weight loss of people adjusting to better portions, but the dangerous weight loss of slow starvation. Cheekbones emerged, ribs became visible, hands trembled from weakness. And still no one came to check on them. No doctor visited their barrack, no officer inquired about their welfare. It was as if they had been filed away and forgotten, a problem no one wanted to acknowledge or solve. 7 Japanese women in a camp built for men, in a war where the Pacific theater was viewed with more hatred than the European, in a state where most people had never seen an Asian face and feared what they did not understand. Despite everything, there were moments of unexpected humanity. A guard named Patterson, older than the others, with a weathered face and kind eyes, sometimes slipped extra bread to the prisoners when no one was looking. He never spoke to them directly, but he would leave a wrapped portion on a work table, turn his back, and walk away. The prisoners learned to watch for these moments, to snatch the food quickly before someone else noticed. Hiroshi tried to learn English from the guards' conversations. He picked up words: water, food, work, yes, no. Simple things that might make life easier. One day he used his few words to ask a guard for medicine for the women. The guard looked at him, surprised that he could speak at all, then shook his head. "Not my department," he said, and walked away. The men sometimes managed to pass notes to the women during the brief moments when both groups were in the mess hall. Tiny scraps of paper, folded small, with messages of encouragement or news from the outside they had gleaned from guards' careless talk. The war continues. Philippines being retaken. Stay strong. Empty words, perhaps, but they were connection, proof that someone remembered, someone cared. Yuki wrote back when she could, using a pencil stub she had hidden in her medical bag. Her notes were practical. Midori very sick. Need medicine. Fumiko fever worsening. Please help. She passed them to Kenji during one meal exchange, their fingers touching briefly, her eyes pleading. Kenji took the notes to Patterson, the kind guard who read them and promised to speak to someone. Nothing changed, no medicine came, no doctor visited. Patterson apologized with his eyes but could do nothing more. He was just a guard, at the bottom of the hierarchy, with no power to challenge the system that had condemned these women to slow neglect. November arrived with cold rain that seemed to fall constantly, turning the camp into a swamp. Water pooled everywhere. The women's barrack, with its poorly sealed walls and leaking roof, became damp inside. Mold grew in the corners. Blankets stayed perpetually wet. The cold was no longer just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. The transformation that occurred in the Japanese prisoners during those months was not the kind described in the propaganda on either side. It was not about ideology or politics or even survival. It was about the slow, terrible realization that they had been abandoned by everyone, their own nation, which had condemned them to fight a war they could not win, and their captors, who had taken them prisoner but could not be bothered to care for them properly. Kenji lay awake at night, listening to the rain hammer against the roof, and thought about honor. He had been taught that honor was everything, that death was preferable to surrender, that a true soldier never allowed himself to be captured. Yet here he was, alive, a prisoner, and the shame of it gnawed at him constantly. But beneath that shame grew something else. Anger. Not at the Americans who had defeated him, but at the system that had told him death was honorable while leaving him to rot in this forgotten corner of Louisiana. Hiroshi, younger and more adaptable, struggled with different questions. He had believed in the cause, or thought he had. Japan would create a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. They would liberate Asia from Western colonialism. The propaganda had been so convincing, the teachers so sure. But watching German prisoners laugh and play while Japanese prisoners scraped by on scraps, he wondered who exactly had been liberated, and for what purpose. The women's transformation was more immediate, more visceral. They had gone from being useful, nurses, teachers, workers, to being invisible. Yuki felt it most acutely. She was a trained nurse, capable of helping, of healing, but here she was powerless, watching her companions sicken while her medical bag grew emptier, and no one cared enough to replenish it. Akiko stopped humming her children's songs. The silence from her was somehow worse than any complaint. Sachiko, the farmer's daughter, stopped talking about her family's fields back home, the seasons of planting and harvest that had structured her entire life until the war. The memories hurt too much now. December brought the first real cold. Temperatures dropped below freezing at night, and the single pot-bellied stove in the men's barrack could not keep up. The men huddled together for warmth, piling blankets, sharing body heat. It was uncomfortable, undignified, but necessary. They woke with frost on the windows, their breath visible in the air inside the barrack. The women had no stove at all. They pushed their beds together, creating one large sleeping area where all 7 could huddle under every blanket they possessed. But it was not enough. The cold seeped through the gaps in the walls, through the poorly sealed windows, through the floor that sat directly on the damp ground with no foundation beneath it. They slept in shifts, some staying awake to rub circulation into the feet and hands of those sleeping, trying to prevent frostbite. Midori's cough, which had been bad since that first night, had become constant, racking her thin frame. Yuki recognized the signs. Pneumonia, almost certainly. Midori's breathing was labored, her lips tinged blue from lack of oxygen. She coughed up phlegm streaked with blood. She ran a low-grade fever that made her sweat even in the cold, soaking through her clothes and leaving her shivering. Yuki had nothing to treat it with. The aspirin was long gone. The iodine was useless for a lung infection. All she could do was try to keep Midori warm, make her drink what little water they were given, and watch helplessly as the infection spread deeper. Fumiko's fever, which had come and gone since the train journey, had settled into a persistent high temperature that would not break. Yuki suspected typhoid or some other bacterial infection. Fumiko complained of terrible headaches, her stomach hurt constantly, and she had developed a rash across her abdomen. She could barely eat, and what she did eat often came back up. She was wasting away, her once strong body growing skeletal as the infection consumed her from within. Ayami, the youngest, had developed severe stomach problems. What had started as occasional cramps had become constant pain that left her doubled over, unable to stand upright. She had bloody diarrhea, a symptom that terrified Yuki because it suggested dysentery or parasites or some other digestive disease that required immediate medical treatment. The girl was literally starving because her damaged digestive system could not process what little food she received. Her face had taken on the sunken, hollow look of advanced malnutrition. Reiko and Sachiko showed classic signs of scurvy and beriberi. Their gums bled when they tried to brush their teeth with fingers and water. Their teeth had started to loosen. They had developed sores on their skin that would not heal. Their legs were swollen with edema, the skin tight and shiny. Reiko complained that her old injuries from the factory collapse had started aching again, the poorly healed wounds breaking open. Sachiko had developed night blindness, unable to see in the dim light of their barrack after sunset. Even Yuki and Akiko, who had been the strongest of the 7, were showing signs of malnutrition and illness. Yuki had lost so much weight that her ribs stood out sharply. Her medical training told her she was suffering from protein deficiency, vitamin deficiencies, probably anemia from the poor diet. Akiko's hair had started falling out in clumps, another symptom of severe malnutrition. Her hands trembled constantly, making it hard for her to hold anything. Yuki knew they were dying. She had known for weeks, but now she could no longer deny it even to herself. Without proper food, without heat, without medicine, without medical care, her companions would die one by one. It was not a question of if, but when. She wrote desperate notes to Kenji, her handwriting shaky from malnutrition and cold. Midori cannot breathe properly. Fumiko fever 40 degrees. Ayami cannot eat. Without doctor, they die. Please, someone must help. We are dying here. The guards looked uncomfortable but did nothing. One of them, a young corporal, actually seemed upset. "I'll tell the CO," he said. But the commanding officer never came. No doctor appeared. The bureaucratic wheels of the military ground slowly when they ground at all, and for 7 Japanese women in a forgotten corner of a sprawling POW complex, they did not grind at all. The men tried to help in what ways they could. They stole blankets from the supply shed, risking punishment to pass them through the fence to the women's barrack. They gave up portions of their own meals, wrapping bread and whatever scraps of protein they could save, leaving them where the women might find them during the brief moments they were allowed outside. Kenji organized the men into shifts, watching for opportunities to communicate with the women, to check on their condition, to maintain some connection to these 7 people who had become symbols of everything wrong with their captivity. It was a small resistance, meaningless in the grand scheme of the war, but it mattered to them. It was the only power they had, the power to care when no one else did. Christmas came and went. The German and Italian prisoners received packages, had special meals, sang carols in their recreation hall. The Japanese prisoners received nothing. The women grew weaker. Midori could no longer stand without help. Fumiko's fever climbed higher. Ayami stopped eating, her stomach too damaged by malnutrition to process food properly. Yuki knew they were dying. She had known for weeks, but now she could no longer deny it, even to herself. She wrote one final note to Kenji, the words blunt and desperate. 3 women dying. Need doctor immediately or they will be dead within days. Please, someone must help. Kenji took the note to Patterson, who took it to his sergeant, who filed it with the camp adjutant, who put it in a pile of paperwork that no one looked at for weeks. The system was not designed for urgency, not for these prisoners, not for these women. They existed in a liminal space, neither important enough to care for properly, nor insignificant enough to simply release. In the women's barrack, Akiko began singing again. But not children's songs this time. She sang Buddhist prayers, death chants, songs to ease the passage from this world to the next. Her voice, thin and reedy in the cold air, carried across the camp at night. The men heard it and understood what it meant. Hiroshi wept openly. Older prisoners bowed their heads in silent prayer. Kenji made a decision. He would go on hunger strike, refuse to work, force someone to pay attention. But the morning he planned to begin, he was called to the administration building. An officer he had never seen before, a captain with thick glasses and a clipboard, told him that work details were being reorganized. He and 6 other prisoners were being assigned to maintain the small cemetery at the edge of camp property. You'll keep the graves tidy, the captain said, not looking up from his clipboard. Rake the leaves, maintain the markers. Simple work. He paused, then added almost casually. Might need to dig some new graves soon. Ground's going to freeze solid soon, so best to prepare. Kenji felt ice form in his stomach. How many graves? He managed to ask. The captain shrugged. 6, maybe 7. Just to be prepared, you understand? Can't be too careful with these things. He understood. They all understood. The camp administration knew the women were dying. And rather than help them, rather than get them medical care, they were preparing graves. It was not cruelty in the active sense. No one was beating them, starving them deliberately, or causing harm on purpose. But it was cruelty nonetheless, the cruelty of indifference, of bureaucratic neglect, of a system that had decided these 7 women were not worth the effort of saving. The first woman died on January 12, 1945. It was Fumiko, the fisherman's daughter, the fever finally consuming what was left of her. She had been unconscious for 2 days, muttering in her delirium about boats and nets and the ocean she would never see again. Yuki sat beside her through the final night, holding her burning hand, watching her breathing grow more and more labored until finally, just before dawn, it stopped. For a moment, Yuki could not process what had happened. She had watched so many men die on Saipan, had held hands and closed eyes and covered faces with bloody sheets. But this was different. This was Fumiko, who had shared her blanket, who had told stories about her village to pass the long hours, who had been alive and talking just days ago. Now she was gone, and it had been so preventable. A simple course of antibiotics, proper food, basic medical care, any of these things might have saved her. When the guards came for roll call and found Fumiko's body, there was a brief commotion. Voices raised, a sergeant called, paperwork produced. The women were ordered outside while guards inspected the body, as if they needed to confirm she was really dead and had not simply died as a trick or a trap. 2 guards carried her body away wrapped in her thin blanket, treating it with neither reverence nor cruelty, just the efficient handling of an object that needed to be moved. Kenji and his detail were ordered to the small cemetery at the edge of camp property. It was a patch of ground that had been designated for burials but rarely used. A few American soldiers who had died in training accidents, a German POW who had succumbed to appendicitis before doctors could operate. Now they were told to dig a grave for a Japanese prisoner. The ground was frozen hard. It took them hours to break through the frost layer, pickaxes ringing against earth that felt like stone. Beneath the frost, the soil was wet and heavy, clay mixed with sand that stuck to their tools and made every shovelful an effort. They worked in silence, their breath steaming in the cold January air, hands blistering and bleeding from the rough wooden handles of their tools. Kenji thought about Fumiko as he dug. He had barely known her, had spoken to her perhaps twice, brief exchanges during mealtimes. But he remembered her face, remembered hearing her talk about fishing with such love and longing. Now he was digging her grave in frozen Louisiana ground, thousands of miles from the ocean she had loved. The injustice of it filled him with a rage he could barely contain. They finished the grave just before dark, a rectangular hole 6 feet deep, the sides straight and proper because even in this they maintained their discipline. Fumiko was buried the next morning in a simple wooden box that the camp carpenter had thrown together in an hour. No ceremony, no prayers, just guards watching as the body was lowered and the prisoners filled the grave back in, the frozen dirt thudding against the wooden coffin like judgment. 3 days later, Midori died. The pneumonia had filled her lungs until she could no longer draw breath, drowning slowly in the fluid her body produced, trying to fight an infection it had no strength to defeat. She died gasping for air that would not come, her fingers clutching at Yuki's arms, eyes wide with the terror of suffocation. Yuki held her and whispered reassurances that were lies, that everything would be fine, that she would be okay when they both knew she would not be. Same process, guards discovering the body, paperwork, orders to dig another grave. The men returned to the cemetery, their hands still healing from the first burial, and broke ground again. The work was no easier the second time. If anything, it was harder, because now they knew this was not an isolated tragedy, but the beginning of something worse. Hiroshi carved Midori's name in Japanese characters on a wooden board, using a knife he had borrowed from the camp carpenter. His hands shook as he worked, from cold and from grief and from the terrible knowledge that he would likely be carving more names before this was over. The board was crude, the characters uneven, but it was all they could offer, this small dignity of remembering her name. Then Ayame, the youngest. She died on January 20th, her body simply giving up after weeks of being unable to digest food. She had wasted to nothing, a skeleton wrapped in skin, her eyes huge in her hollowed face. At the end, she had been too weak to speak, could only look at the other women with an expression that begged forgiveness for dying, for leaving them, for not being strong enough to survive. She was 18 years old. The men dug her grave with tears streaming down their faces that froze on their cheeks. Young Daiichi, only a year older than Ayame had been, broke down completely, falling to his knees in the cemetery and sobbing like a child. The guards watched uncomfortably but said nothing. Even they could see this was wrong, that something terrible was happening, but they were cogs in a machine that did not know how to care. Sachiko died next on January 24th. The scurvy had progressed too far, internal bleeding that her body could not stop. She died quietly, almost peacefully, her last words about rice fields and the mountains of her home. Then Reiko, 2 days later, her body finally succumbing to infections from wounds that had never properly healed, sepsis spreading through her blood. 5 women dead in less than 2 weeks. 5 graves dug in the frozen cemetery. 5 wooden markers with Japanese characters carved by Hiroshi's increasingly unsteady hand. The men worked mechanically now. Digging graves had become their primary job, more important than maintaining roads or repairing fences. They were gravediggers, burying women who should have lived. By early February, only Yuki and Akiko remained, both of them sick, both of them fading. Yuki had developed a cough that sounded disturbingly like Midori's had. Akiko had stopped speaking entirely, existing in a world of silent suffering. The camp administration, finally recognizing that something needed to be done, had the 6th grave dug preemptively. The frozen ground would only get harder, they reasoned. Better to prepare. On February 15, 1945, something changed. The change came without warning, announced only by the unusual sight of 3 staff cars arriving at the camp gates in mid-morning, when no deliveries or inspections were scheduled. An inspection was scheduled, not the usual routine check by the camp CO, but a surprise inspection by a team from the War Department. The visit had been prompted by questions in Congress, by newspaper articles about POW treatment, by growing concerns that America's moral high ground in the war was being undermined by reports of mistreatment of prisoners. The inspectors arrived in clean uniforms, carrying clipboards and cameras, 3 officers from the War Department and a civilian interpreter who had been brought specifically to communicate with Japanese prisoners. They were led by Major Harrison, a career officer with a reputation for thoroughness and an absolute refusal to accept convenient lies. He had inspected camps across the country, had seen both the best and worst of America's POW system, and had reported honestly on both. The camp CO, a captain named Webster who had been hoping to avoid any real scrutiny, tried to control the inspection. He led them first to the German barracks, which he knew were acceptable. The buildings were heated, the bunks had mattresses, the men had recreational facilities. The inspectors made notes but seemed unsurprised. Then to the Italian barracks, which were similar. Again notes, no major concerns. Then Captain Webster tried to bypass the Japanese annex entirely, suggesting they move on to inspect the kitchen facilities. But Major Harrison had studied the camp manifests on the drive over. He knew there were supposed to be Japanese prisoners here. "Where are the Japanese POWs housed?" he asked, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate answers. Webster stammered something about a separate facility, tried to explain about limited resources and different requirements. Harrison cut him off and simply started walking toward the Japanese annex, following the fence line. The other inspectors and the interpreter followed. Webster had no choice but to accompany them, sweat beading on his forehead despite the February cold. They toured the men's barracks first. Harrison's expression grew darker with each detail he noted. The inadequate heating, the worn blankets, the overcrowding, the lack of any recreational facilities, the visible signs of malnutrition on the prisoners' faces. He questioned the prisoners through the interpreter, asking about food, about medical care, about treatment. The answers he received were careful, measured. The prisoners knew that speaking too freely could bring retribution after the inspectors left, but even their careful words painted a picture of systematic neglect. Then Harrison noticed the isolated barrack at the far end of the compound. "What's that building?" he asked. Webster tried to deflect, to suggest it was just storage, but Harrison was already walking toward it, his junior officers and the interpreter following. Webster tried once more to redirect them, but Harrison ignored him completely. Harrison reached the building and pulled open the door. The smell hit him immediately, so strong he physically recoiled. Sickness, unwashed bodies, human waste, mold, the sweet rot smell of infection and dying. He covered his nose and mouth with his hand and stepped inside anyway, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. 2 women lying on beds pushed together in the center of the room, barely conscious, their faces skeletal with malnutrition. The walls showed water damage, mold growing in visible patches. Gaps in the boards let in cold wind. There was no heating of any kind. Buckets in the corner that had not been emptied served as latrines. The blankets were thin and filthy. The floor was damp. Yuki looked up at him with fever-bright eyes, too weak to be frightened, too sick to care who he was or why he had come. She tried to speak but could only cough, a wet, rattling sound that made Harrison's throat tighten. Akiko did not look up at all, did not seem aware that anyone had entered, lost in her own world of suffering. Harrison stood frozen for a moment, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. This was America. This was a United States military facility. These were prisoners under American protection, regardless of what treaties did or did not cover them. And they had been left to die in conditions worse than any he had seen in his years of inspections. He turned slowly to face Webster, his face white with barely controlled fury. His voice when he spoke was quiet, but carried more weight than any shout could have. "How long have they been like this?" Webster stammered something about limited resources, about the Japanese not being covered by the Geneva Convention, about doing the best they could with what they had, about 7 women being a complication no one had planned for. Harrison cut him off with a gesture. "How many women were there originally?" Webster consulted a paper from his pocket. 7, sir." Harrison looked around the barrack, counting the empty beds, the possessions that clearly belonged to more than 2 people. "I see beds for 7. I see 2 women. Where are the other 5? The silence that followed was answer enough. Webster finally managed. They died, sir, over the past few weeks." Harrison's jaw clenched so tight it trembled. "Show me where they're buried. Now." That afternoon, the inspectors interviewed the prisoners. Kenji was called to the administration building. Through the interpreter, Japanese-American soldier from California, he told them everything. The cold, the hunger, the sickness, the pleas for help that went ignored, the graves they had been ordered to dig before the women died, as if their deaths were inevitable and expected. "We buried 6 women today," Kenji said, his voice breaking. "Not today exactly, but these weeks. 6 women who survived the war, survived capture, survived the journey here. They survived everything except being forgotten." The interpreter translated, his own voice thick with emotion. Major Harrison listened, his jaw clenched so tight it trembled. When Kenji finished, Harrison had only one question. "Did anyone ever come to check on the women? Any doctor? Any medical officer?" Kenji shook his head. "No one. We asked. We begged. No one came." Harrison stood and saluted Kenji, a gesture so unexpected that Kenji froze, unsure how to respond. "I am sorry," Harrison said through the interpreter. "This should never have happened. This will never happen again." He turned to the other inspectors. "We're shutting this facility down. Immediately." The camp was shut down within 48 hours. Yuki and Akiko were rushed to the military hospital at Fort Polk, where doctors worked frantically to save them. Yuki survived, Akiko did not. She died 3 days after the transfer, bringing the final death toll to 7. 7 women who had survived the Pacific War, only to die in the Louisiana swamps from simple neglect. The male prisoners were transferred to a larger, better-equipped facility in Texas. Before they left, they were allowed to visit the cemetery one final time. Kenji stood before the 7 graves and bowed deeply, his forehead nearly touching the frozen ground. Around him, the other prisoners did the same. They had failed to save these women, but they had witnessed, they had remembered, and they would carry that memory for the rest of their lives. Hiroshi placed small stones on each grave, a Japanese tradition. Others left folded paper cranes they had made from scraps, prayers written in characters most Americans would never read or understand. The cemetery stood silent in the February cold, 7 graves that told a story of bureaucratic failure, of racism and neglect, of the price paid by those who existed outside the protection of treaties and conventions. The camp CO was reassigned, a quiet transfer that avoided the scandal of a court-martial but removed him from any position of responsibility. Patterson, the kind guard, testified at the internal investigation, his testimony damning in its detail about conditions he had reported and been ignored. The investigation concluded that while no individual had intentionally caused harm, the system itself had failed catastrophically. New protocols were established. Japanese POWs would receive the same treatment as other prisoners, Geneva Convention or not. Regular medical inspections would be mandatory. Female prisoners would have female staff overseeing their care. Red Cross access would be granted regardless of treaty status. The 7 graves had purchased changes that would save other lives. But for Kenji and the others, these changes came too late. They had buried 6 women, 7, counting Akiko who died later, and no amount of policy revision could bring them back. In the Texas camp, conditions were indeed better. Heated barracks, adequate food, medical care, even recreation facilities. It was what the Louisiana camp should have been from the start. Kenji received mail for the first time, letters that had been held up in the bureaucratic mess of the previous camp. One was from his sister in Japan, written months before, telling him their mother had died in an air raid. He held the letter and wept, not just for his mother, but for Fumiko and Midori and Ayame and Sachiko and Reiko and Akiko and Yuki. For all the women who had died far from home, their deaths as senseless as war itself. The war ended in August 1945. The Japanese prisoners were eventually repatriated, sent back to a homeland devastated by firebombing and atomic weapons. Kenji returned to find his city in ruins, his family scattered. He worked as a day laborer, rebuilt his life slowly, married, had children, but he never forgot Louisiana. Every year on February 15th, he observed a moment of silence. His children asked why, and when they were old enough, he told them. About the camp, about the women, about the graves he had dug in frozen ground while bureaucrats shuffled papers and 7 people died of neglect. Hiroshi became a teacher after the war, dedicated to ensuring the next generation understood not just the glory of Japan's past, but the failures, the mistakes, the human cost of war. He taught his students about honor, yes, but also about compassion, about the duty to care for those in your charge, regardless of who they were or where they came from. Yuki, the sole survivor of the 7 women, returned to nursing. She worked in hospitals across Japan, specializing in caring for the most forgotten patients, the elderly, the mentally ill, those who existed at the margins of society. When asked why she chose this work, she would say simply, "Because I know what it is to be forgotten, and I will not let others suffer that fate." In Louisiana, the camp was dismantled after the war. The barracks torn down, the fences removed, the land returned to swamp. But the cemetery remained. For years it was unmarked, unknown, the graves slowly sinking into the soft earth. Then in the 1990s, a historian researching POW camps discovered the records. The 7 graves were located, restored, properly marked. Today, a small memorial stands at the site. 7 names, 7 dates, and a plaque that reads, "In memory of 7 Japanese women who died in captivity, February 1945. May we never forget that the cost of indifference is measured in human lives." And so the graves became more than just burial sites. They became testimony. Proof that war's victims are not always soldiers on battlefields, but sometimes prisoners forgotten in remote camps, bureaucratic failures measured in lives lost to neglect. For those Japanese prisoners, the act of digging those graves changed them. It stripped away the abstractions of war, honor, duty, ideology, and replaced them with something more fundamental. The weight of a shovel, the sound of dirt falling on wood, the knowledge that they were burying women who should have lived, who could have lived if anyone had cared enough to try. The Americans who discovered the camp were changed too. Major Harrison spent the rest of his career advocating for POW welfare, haunted by what he had found in that isolated Louisiana barrack. The young interpreter went on to become a civil rights activist, the memory of those graves fueling his fight against injustice in all its forms. As Kenji told his grandchildren years later, in a story that became family history, "We buried 6 women and then a 7th. Each grave we dug taught us that being forgotten is sometimes worse than being hated. Hatred acknowledges your existence, but to be forgotten, to be filed away as too much trouble to care about, that is the deepest cruelty." The shovels, the frozen ground, the simple wooden markers, these became symbols of a truth that transcends war and peace, nation and enemy. That every life matters, that neglect kills as surely as violence, and that the obligation to care for those in our power is absolute, regardless of circumstance. And that is the story worth remembering. 7 women who died not from battle or bombing, but from being forgotten. 7 graves that taught a lesson about the cost of indifference. 7 lives that remind us, even now, that how we treat the powerless defines who we are, far more than how we treat the powerful. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. These are the stories that history often overlooks, the small tragedies that reveal larger truths. By subscribing, you help ensure these voices are not forgotten again. Thank you for watching and for remembering with us.